They say soul food is fried chicken and mac and cheese, but that's a lie. The real story? It starts with scraps, pig feet, corn husks, wild weeds, food nobody else wanted, and somehow it became the backbone of American cooking. But here's what nobody tells you. Every single dish carries a secret, a memory, a fight for survival that most history books erase. From the plantation fields to the trains heading north, to the marches that changed the nation, soul food was there, feeding bodies, fueling hope, and refusing to be forgotten. Stick around, because this story will change the way you taste everything. People from Africa were stolen from their homes and forced to work on big farms called plantations. They weren't paid, they weren't free, and they were only given the food scraps that nobody else wanted. Millions of African people, mothers, fathers, children, grandparents, ripped away from everything they knew. This nightmare started over 400 years ago, back in the 1600s, and didn't end until 1865. That's more than 200 years of stolen lives on huge plantations across the South. Virginia, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, where cotton and tobacco made white owners rich while black hands did all the work. Because greed. Plain and simple. Plantation owners wanted wealth without paying for it, so they built an empire on the backs of enslaved people. They turned scraps into miracles, pig feet into stew, cornmeal into bread, wild greens into medicine. They didn't just cook to eat, they cooked to endure, to remember, to stay human when the world tried to erase them. And that's where soul food was born. In this first part of our journey, we're uncovering 25 survival foods from the plantation era, the forgotten meals that kept people alive through one of the darkest chapters in history, and the hidden roots of dishes still on our tables today. Stick around, because some of these will shock you. But what you're about to see isn't just history. It's the beginning of a flavor revolution that nobody saw coming. 1. Parched corn, toasted dried kernels. When hunger hit hard in the fields, there wasn't always a pot or fire to cook a meal. That's where parched corn came in. Enslaved people would toast dried kernels until they browned and popped with flavor. It was portable, it was filling, and it could last for weeks without spoiling. Think of it as their original trail mix, except it wasn't for hiking trips, it was for survival. Parched corn gave enough energy to push through back-breaking work, and sometimes it was all a person had to eat for an entire day. Fast forward to today, and you'll see echoes of it in kettle corn at a fair, or the roasted corn nuts sold in gas stations. But for those living on plantations, this wasn't a snack, it was life or death. And here's the twist. This simple survival food didn't just keep people alive, it became the seed of Southern food traditions that we still taste today. But what happened when the corn ran out? The answer was another dish so plain, so bare bones, it shocked even visiting outsiders. 2. Boiled cornmeal mush. If parched corn was the pocket food of survival, then cornmeal mush was the hot meal that kept folks going at night. Just cornmeal, water, and salt, boiled until it thickened into a heavy porridge. No milk, no butter, none of the extras we throw in today. Just enough to quiet an empty stomach. This dish was so common, it showed up in slave narratives again and again. Sometimes it was ladled into wooden troughs where children would gather around with spoons, eating side by side like piglets at a pen. Brutal, humbling, but it kept them alive. Here's the part that sticks. Mush wasn't just dinner. Cold leftovers were sliced and fried the next day, turning into something closer to polenta cakes. That simple stretch, boiling once, frying twice, doubled the food supply and saved scraps that might have gone to waste. Fast forward to today, and you'll still see its shadow in Southern fried cornmeal cakes, or even Italian polenta fries on restaurant menus. But for the enslaved, mush was survival stripped bare, plain, heavy, and unforgettable. 3. Turnip greens stew. When scraps of meat were scarce, and they almost always were, enslaved families turned to the earth itself. Turnip greens, those bitter leaves most folks tossed aside, became the backbone of survival stews. Boiled soft, seasoned with nothing more than a pinch of salt, or maybe a scrap of pork fat if you were lucky, this wasn't comfort food. It was endurance food. But here's the thing. Greens carried more than just calories. They gave strength. They filled the belly with warmth when winter winds cut through thin clothes in bare cabins. A pot of turnip greens simmering on a fire wasn't just food. It was hope stretched into a meal. Over time, that bitter, earthy flavor became familiar, even cherished. Families passed down ways to soften the bite. Slow cooking, mixing in roots, adding in whatever scraps they could. And that tradition echoes loud today. Walk into a southern kitchen and you'll still see pots of greens on the stove, collards, mustards, or turnips, seasoned up and served with cornbread. But for the enslaved, it started with survival, not taste. A stew made of leaves, stalks, and scraps most people wouldn't touch. 4th, cowpea stew. Long before black-eyed peas were a New Year's tradition, they were a survival food on the plantations. Enslaved Africans carried knowledge of cowpeas with them across the ocean. Hardy beans that grew well in the southern heat and poor soil. Cheap, filling, and packed with protein, they were a lifeline when meat was just a memory. Cowpea stew was simple. Boil the beans soft, add a little salt, maybe toss in a scrap of pork rind if you had it. Sometimes it simmered with wild herbs or onions from the fields, but more often it was just beans and water, plain, heavy, and sustaining. But here's the powerful twist. Cowpeas weren't just survival food, they were a taste of home. For many enslaved people, this was one of the few foods that tied them back to Africa, where cowpeas had been cooked for generations in stews and porridges. Eating them wasn't just filling the belly, it was holding onto a piece of identity in a world trying to erase it. And today, that legacy is alive every time black-eyed peas are served with rice or simmered into hop and john. What started as a survival stew is now a symbol of luck, prosperity, and Southern tradition. But survival wasn't always planted or grown. Sometimes it was plucked straight from the dirt and boiled down into something barely edible. 5. Dandelion greens, boiled soft. When you think of dandelions today, you probably picture weeds in the yard, something to spray or pull out. But for enslaved families, those so-called weeds were a gift from the earth. Dandelion greens grew wild, needed no planting, and filled pots when nothing else was left. Boiled soft, the greens lost some of their bitterness, though not all. Sometimes they were flavored with a splash of vinegar, maybe a sliver of fat, but most days it was just greens and water. A thin broth, a chewy bite, and just enough to take the edge off hunger. Here's the hidden beauty. Dandelions carried nutrients, iron, vitamins, strength. Even if plantation owners didn't know or care, enslaved cooks understood that these weeds were more than filler. They were survival medicine, and this survival food didn't fade away. In parts of the South, dandelion greens were eaten well into the 20th century, and today they've circled back as a trendy superfood in fancy restaurants and health stores. Imagine that. What was once desperation food now sells for $5 a bundle. But if bitter weeds could become a meal, imagine what happened when the rare sweetness of sugar trickled into enslaved hands. 6. Molasses water, sweet ration drink. Sugar was money on the plantations, and enslaved people rarely tasted it. But every so often, they'd be given a ration of molasses. Thick, dark, sticky. It wasn't candy, but it was sweet. And that sweetness meant everything. The simplest way to make it last? Stir a spoonful into a tin cup of water. That was molasses water, a poor man's energy drink. It gave quick calories, a burst of sweetness in a life where flavor was almost always bitter. For children, that cup was a rare treat. For adults, it was fuel, enough to push through another day in the fields. Sometimes it doubled as medicine too, mixed with herbs to soothe coughs or settle the stomach. What's wild is how much this echoes forward. Molasses water was survival, but it was also the seed of southern desserts, barbecue sauces, and baked goods we love today. That sticky sweetness shaped the flavor of an entire region. But if molasses was rare gold, the next food was the opposite. Scraps so unwanted that plantation owners tossed them aside. And yet, enslaved cooks turned them into a meal that still stirs debate today. 7. Salt pork scraps, fried or boiled. Meat was a luxury enslaved people almost never saw, unless it was the parts nobody else wanted. That's where salt pork scraps came in. Plantation owners kept the hams, chops, and roasts, while the fat trimmings, rinds, and scraps went to the slave quarters. Fried in a pan, those scraps released grease that seasoned everything from beans to greens. Boiled, they became chewy bites in a pot of stew. And when there wasn't even meat left, just the fat, enslaved cooks saved every drop, stretching it to flavor cornmeal mush or bitter greens. Here's the hard truth. Salt pork was never meant to be a gift. It was cheap, preserved, and considered unfit for proper tables. But in the hands of enslaved people, it became a cornerstone of survival cooking. That salty, smoky flavor carried through entire meals, making scraps taste like feasts. And the legacy? You can still taste it today. Southern soul food, from collard greens simmered with ham hock to fried cabbage with bacon, traces back to those scraps. What was once cast off has become comfort. But meat scraps weren't the only thing enslaved cooks transformed. When gardens and fields thinned out, they turned to pumpkins and wild greens, simmering them into a survival stew that fed entire families. 8. Pumpkin and wild greens pottage. When food was running thin, enslaved cooks had to get creative with whatever the land gave up. Pumpkins, growing wild in patches, and bitter greens from the fields often ended up together in one pot. The result was a pottage, a simple stew that was more survival than celebration. Chunks of pumpkin gave sweetness and body, while the greens, tough, bitter, and stringy, filled out the pot. Sometimes the whole thing simmered with just water and salt. Other times, if luck struck, a sliver of pork fat or a stray onion added flavor. Nothing was wasted, nothing was fancy, but together it made enough to share. Here's the thing, this wasn't just food, it was survival alchemy, taking the bland, the bitter, and the unwanted, and turning them into something warm and filling. That kind of cooking taught resourcefulness, taught endurance, and the echo still lingers. You can see it today in southern pumpkin soups, fall stews, even the way greens get cooked down low and slow until they soften into comfort. What started as a poor man's pottage has become a backbone of seasonal cooking. But pumpkins held another secret too. Not just the flesh, but the seeds. Roasted, salted, and eaten by the handful, they were the snack that carried people through the leanest days. 9. Roasted pumpkin seeds. After the pumpkin flesh went into the pot, nothing was thrown away, not even the seeds. Enslaved families would wash them, dry them, and roast them over hot coals. With a little salt, if they had it, the seeds became a rare, crunchy snack. They weren't just tasty. Pumpkin seeds packed protein and fat, things that were scarce in a diet built mostly on grains and greens. For children especially, a handful of roasted seeds could mean the difference between going to bed starving and sleeping with at least a little comfort. Here's what makes it powerful. This was survival food born out of waste. What most plantation kitchens scooped out and tossed, enslaved cooks transformed into something useful, even enjoyable. That instinct to save, to stretch, to make something from nothing defined survival. And it's a tradition that stuck. Today, roasted pumpkin seeds show up in snack bags at gas stations, sprinkled over salads, even sold as superfoods in health stores. What was once desperation food now sells for dollars. But while seeds could be roasted into a treat, the root of the turnip offered another kind of survival. Roasted slowly until it was soft enough to stand in for bread or meat. 10. Turnip root roast. When bread was a luxury and meat was a dream, the humble turnip root became the next best thing. Dug straight from the dirt, scrubbed clean, and roasted in the ashes of a fire, it transformed from hard and bitter into something soft, earthy, and faintly sweet. Enslaved families treated roasted turnips like filler food, something to quiet hunger when cornmeal was gone. Sometimes it was eaten plain, sometimes mashed, and sometimes sliced thin and fried in pork fat if scraps were available. A poor man's potato, a survival man's bread. But here's the striking part. Roasting brought out a richness that made it almost feel like a treat. Imagine the smell of a smoky fire, the root blackened on the outside, steaming on the inside. It wasn't just food, it was warmth, something you could hold in your hands on a cold night. And this practice didn't fade. Roasted root vegetables became part of Southern kitchens, church suppers, and even holiday tables. What started as survival cooking carved a permanent place in American food traditions. But if the turnip root filled bellies, the next dish, a mash of corn and okra, carried flavors that connected enslaved Africans directly back to their homeland. 11. Okra and corn. Mashed okra wasn't native to America. It came over on slave ships, carried in memory and in seeds hidden in cloth. On the plantations, it grew well in the southern heat, and enslaved cooks mixed it with the one crop they always had, corn. The result was okra and corn mash, a dish that was simple, filling, and tied directly to Africa. The mash was usually just okra pods sliced thin, boiled down with ground corn or grits until it became a thick, sticky stew, sometimes slimy, sometimes gritty, but always enough to fill a stomach. When scraps of pork or onion were around, they'd get tossed in for flavor. But most nights, it was just the two staples, corn and okra. Here's the deeper story. Every bite of this dish was survival, yes, but it was also cultural memory. Okra stews and corn porridges were already part of African diets long before slavery. So when enslaved families mixed them together in America, they weren't just eating, they were preserving a piece of who they were. And you still see it today. Gumbo, succotash, and southern okra dishes all trace back to that mash. What started as survival in slave quarters became flavor woven into the South's identity. But when food didn't grow in fields or gardens, survival sometimes meant chasing it down in the woods, like the sweet fruit of the persimmon tree. 12. Foraged persimmons, mashed or eaten raw. Sweetness was rare on the plantation table, which made persimmons feel like treasure. Growing wild in southern woods and fields, these small orange fruits looked harmless enough, but bite into one before it was ripe, and your mouth puckered from the bitter astringency. Wait until the frost hit, though, and that same fruit turned soft, sweet, and golden. Enslaved families knew the trick. They foraged persimmons late in the season, eating them raw or mashing them into pulp. Sometimes the mash was dried into thin cakes, carried as a pocket food for long days in the fields. Other times, it was stirred into water to make a kind of sweet drink, like nature's answer to molasses. Persimmons weren't just about flavor. They were about luck, timing, and knowledge of the land. Knowing when to pick them, how to prepare them, and how to stretch them made the difference between a bitter mistake and a rare moment of sweetness in an otherwise harsh life. And persimmons never disappeared. You can still find them in southern backyards, turned into puddings, breads, and even country wine. What was once a foraged survival fruit became a hidden jewel of southern cooking. But fruit wasn't always plentiful. More often, survival meant making do with broken grains, the cast-off pieces of rice that planters considered worthless. 13. Broken rice porridge, Carolina middlings. On the Carolina plantations, rice was king, But enslaved families almost never saw the fine, polished grains that made planters rich. What they got instead were the middlings, broken bits of rice left over after milling. To the owners, it was waste. To the enslaved, it was survival. Those fragments were boiled into a thin porridge, sometimes salted, sometimes mixed with scraps of beans or greens, but most of the time just rice and water. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't filling for long, but it was fuel for another day of work. Here's the striking part. Enslaved Africans already had deep knowledge of rice cultivation and cooking from their homelands. They knew how to coax flavor and sustenance from even the broken grains. And in that, they preserved not just their bodies, but their culture. That broken rice porridge was a lifeline. And over time, the idea of stretching humble rice into soups, porridges, and stews became a cornerstone of Southern kitchens. Even today, dishes like rice, gruel, or kanji-style porridges echo that same survival method. But when rice was gone, enslaved families turned to what the woods gave them: wild fruits that clung to vines and stained fingers purple. 14. Wild muscadine grapes. Deep in the southern woods, tangled vines offered a secret gift: muscadine grapes, thick-skinned, bursting with juice. These wild grapes weren't the neat, seedless kind you see in stores today. They were messy, tart, and sometimes sweet enough to feel like a miracle. For enslaved families, muscadines were a rare taste of abundance. Children foraged for them, staining their hands and mouths purple, while adults mashed them into pulps or boiled them down for juice. If enough were gathered, the fruit could even be preserved into syrups, a way to stretch the sweetness into the lean months. Here's the deeper meaning. Muscadines weren't just food, they were freedom food. They grew outside the plantation's control, in woods and thickets, ripe for the taking if you knew where to look. Finding them was a small act of independence, a reminder that the land still gave gifts even in the harshest times. And muscadines never left Southern life. Today, they're turned into jellies, wines, and juices, prized as a native fruit. What once kept hunger at bay now sits bottled on store shelves. But the next food was no gift of the land. It came from the slaughterhouse, a cut so unwanted most people wouldn't touch it: the tongue of a cow. 15. Boiled cow tongue. On the plantation, the best cuts of beef never reached the slave quarters. But when a cow was butchered, parts like the tongue, tough, fatty, and considered undesirable, sometimes did. Enslaved cooks wasted nothing, and boiled cow tongue became both survival and ingenuity. The preparation was plain. The tongue was scrubbed, boiled for hours until tender, and then sliced thin. Sometimes a pinch of salt or a splash of vinegar gave it flavor, but most of the time it was eaten just as it was: chewy, heavy, and filling. Here's the truth. Tongue wasn't just a scrap. It was a rare source of real protein and fat in a diet that leaned heavily on grains and greens. For families used to stretching vegetables and corn into meals, having actual meat, even from the tongue, felt like a victory. And what's fascinating is how that scrap transformed over time. Today, beef tongue is a delicacy in cuisines around the world, from tacos de lengua in Mexico to deli-style tongue sandwiches in New York. What the enslaved once ate out of necessity is now served on menus for a premium. But when meat like this was rare, survival meant turning back to the grind, literally, with cracked corn boiled into plain grits. 16. Cracked corn grits, plain. If there was one food that never disappeared from the slave diet, it was corn. Ground fine, it became mush. Left in bigger pieces, it became grits. Enslaved families boiled cracked corn in water until it swelled and softened into a thick, plain porridge. No butter, no cream, no cheese, just corn and water. This dish was filling, but it wasn't indulgence. It was survival fuel. Heavy enough to quiet the belly, simple enough to make in one pot, and cheap enough to always be on hand. Day after day, grits showed up at the table in some form, morning or night. Here's the part that resonates. Even though it was plain, grits became a foundation of Southern cooking. Over time, with seasoning, milk, or gravy, they turned from survival food into comfort food. But in the slave quarters, plain grits were often the first bite of the day. and sometimes the only one. It's a reminder of how staples endure. Today, grits are dressed up with shrimp in fancy restaurants or smothered with cheese at diners. But their root story is far grimmer. A bowl of cracked corn keeping bodies alive under impossible conditions. And while grits warmed the body, enslaved families also turned to the woods for warmth in another way, steeping the roots of sassafras trees into a survival tea. 17. Sassafras root tea. When water alone grew dull, enslaved families turned to the woods for flavor. The root of the sassafras tree, dug from the earth and boiled, made a tea unlike anything else, earthy, fragrant, with a hint of sweetness. Long before root beer was ever bottled, sassafras root tea was a survival drink. It wasn't just about taste. Sassafras was believed to have healing powers. A hot cup of the tea soothed coughs, eased fevers, and gave comfort when no real medicine was available. For people forced to work sunup to sundown with little rest, that mattered. Here's the striking part. Enslaved cooks weren't just boiling roots out of desperation. They carried herbal knowledge from Africa and learned new ones from Native Americans, blending traditions to survive. Sassafras became more than a drink. It was resilience in a cup, and this survival tea left a lasting mark. Centuries later, its flavor inspired root beer, a drink now loved worldwide, but its origin wasn't sweet soda in frosty mugs. It was enslaved families huddled by firelight, sipping warmth from a root pulled out of the ground. But not everything from the land was brewed or boiled. Some foods were preserved, like cucumbers and peppers, dropped into brine to last through lean months. 18. Pickled cucumbers and peppers, brine preserve. Fresh food never lasted long in the slave quarters, so preserving became a way to stretch the harvest. With just salt, water, and time, enslaved cooks turned cucumbers and peppers into sharp, tangy pickles that could last for weeks. The process was simple. Slice the vegetables, pack them into jars or crocks, and pour over brine. After sitting a few days, the crunch softened, but the flavor grew bold, sour, salty, sometimes even spicy if peppers were used. For families eating plain corn mush or bitter greens, a pickle on the side was a burst of flavor that made survival meals bearable. Pickling wasn't just about taste, though. It was about security. When gardens and fields stopped producing, those jars of preserved vegetables meant there was still something to fall back on. A sour bite in the dead of winter could mean the difference between another day of strength and the edge of hunger. And the legacy? Southern kitchens never let it go. Chow chow, pepper relish, bread and butter pickles, all trace back to those first brined jars on the plantation. What started as necessity became tradition. But not every survival food came from the garden. Sometimes it meant cracking open the hardest gifts of the forest, like black walnuts, bitter and stubborn, but worth the effort. 19. Foraged black walnuts. If you've ever cracked open a black walnut, you know it's no easy task. The shells are thick, the stain seeps into your hands, and the nut meat hides deep inside. But for enslaved families, black walnuts were worth every strike of a rock or hammer. Gathered from the forest floor, the nuts were prized for their richness. Once cracked, the kernels offered protein, fat, and a flavor far stronger than regular walnuts. Sometimes they were eaten raw. Other times, chopped and stirred into porridges or used to stretch a simple dessert when molasses was on hand. Here's the deeper truth. Black walnuts weren't just food. They were survival treasure. Every nut cracked meant energy stored, a small victory against hunger. Families would save them for lean months or carry them into the fields for quick strength, and over time, their legacy spread. Black walnut cake, black walnut ice cream, even old-fashioned candies all stem from a food enslaved people first foraged out of necessity. What the land gave as hardship, they turned into nourishment. But when nuts and fruit weren't around, survival meant scraping from the core of the garden itself, boiling down cabbage hearts and stems that others would have thrown away. 20. Stewed cabbage cores. On the plantation, the crisp outer leaves of cabbage might make it to the owner's table, but the tough, woody cores, those were tossed aside. In the slave quarters, though, cabbage cores weren't waste. They were boiled down, softened, and transformed into survival stew. The cores were chopped and simmered for hours until the fibers gave way. Sometimes they were flavored with a pinch of salt or, if fortune smiled, a scrap of pork fat. More often, it was just cabbage and water, thin, bland, but enough to put something warm in an empty belly. Here's what's powerful. Enslaved families had no room for waste. What others discarded, they found a way to eat. Those cabbage cores filled the pot and stretched meals a little further. And in a world where every calorie counted, even the scraps mattered. And this resourcefulness left a mark. Southern kitchens to this day have recipes that use the whole vegetable, stewed cabbage, braised stalks, even pickled stems. What began as desperation cooking became part of the region's food identity. But not every preservation was so plain. Sometimes survival came with spice, like green tomato chow chow, a tangy relish that added bite to otherwise bland meals. 21. Green tomato chow chow, relish. When harvest ended and tomatoes were left hanging green on the vine, enslaved cooks refused to let them go to waste. They chopped those unripe tomatoes, mixed them with peppers, onions, vinegar, and salt, then simmered it all into a sharp relish called chow chow. It was bright, tangy, and a little spicy, the kind of flavor that could cut through the heaviness of beans, corn mush, or boiled greens. A spoonful on the side turned plain survival food into something that actually sparked the taste buds. And in a world where meals were usually bitter or bland, that mattered more than most people realize. But here's the bigger picture. Chow chow wasn't just about flavor. It was preservation. By pickling and spicing what couldn't ripen, enslaved families stretched food into the cold months when gardens went bare. It was a survival strategy hidden in a relish jar, and its legacy still shines. To this day, Southern tables, from barbecue joints to Sunday suppers, serve chow chow alongside meats, beans, and cornbread. What started as a way to save scraps has become a Southern tradition with roots deep in the slave quarters. But when vegetables weren't enough, people turned to the land again, this time roasting roots to brew a bitter drink that stood in for coffee. 22. Chicory coffee, roasted chicory brew. Coffee was a luxury reserved for the big house. But in the slave quarters, enslaved families found their own substitute. They dug up the roots of the chicory plant, roasted them dark, and ground them into a coarse powder. When brewed with hot water, it made a bitter, smoky drink that looked and felt like coffee, even if it wasn't. For many, chicory brew wasn't just about taste. It was about ritual, having something warm to sip at dawn before the fields, or late at night when the body ached. It gave comfort, a small piece of dignity, and sometimes even fooled the mind into thinking it was the real thing. Here's the twist. Chicory didn't vanish when slavery ended. In New Orleans especially, it became a tradition. Even today, famous cafes blend chicory with coffee, serving a drink that traces back to the ingenuity of enslaved people making do with what they had. So while the masters drank imported beans, the enslaved sipped roasted roots. Both cups were hot. Both carried meaning, but only one was born of survival. And when even roots couldn't satisfy hunger, enslaved cooks turned to the barest scraps, bones tossed aside, boiling them down into broths that carried families through famine. 23. Scrap bone broth. When the meat was gone, when even the fat and scraps were picked clean, there was still one thing left: the bones. Plantation kitchens threw them out, but in the slave quarters, nothing was wasted. Enslaved families gathered those discarded bones, dropped them in a pot of water, and simmered them for hours. The result was scrap bone broth, thin, oily, but rich with whatever nutrients the marrow could release. It wasn't hearty stew. Most of the time, there was no meat left on the bone, but slowly boiling them pulled out flavor, strength, and just enough fat to stretch plain, corn mush, or greens. For children and the sick, that broth could mean the difference between weakness and another day's work. Here's the hidden truth. Bone broth today is sold as a health craze, bottled, branded, and expensive. But its roots go back to survival cooking in slave quarters, where it was never about wellness trends. It was about staying alive. With bones stripped bare, survival often turned back to the fields again, this time to the simplest harvest of all, fresh green corn, roasted in its husk over open flames. 24. Roasted green corn in husk. In late summer, when the corn was still tender and green on the stalk, enslaved families would slip into the fields and pull a few ears. The simplest way to eat it was to toss the whole thing, husk and all, onto hot coals. After a few minutes, the husks blackened, the kernels steamed, and roasted green corn was ready. The flavor was smoky, sweet, and filling. A rare treat that needed no pot, no seasoning, no scraps of meat, just fire and patience. Children especially loved it, gnawing down to the cob, savoring every bite. For adults, it was quick fuel after grueling days, a way to enjoy the harvest before the fields were picked clean for the plantation. Here's the striking part. Roasted corn wasn't just survival, it was joy. One of the few moments when food felt like a gift instead of a ration. Gathered around the fire, husks in hand, enslaved families found a small taste of freedom in the simplest of foods, and that tradition carried forward. Today, roasted corn shows up at fairs, festivals, and backyard cookouts across America. What once meant endurance now means celebration. But the last dish on this survival list takes us back to the wild. A thin, sharp broth brewed from onions and garlic pulled straight from the earth. 25. Wild onion and garlic soup. Thin broth. Out in the fields and woods, enslaved families foraged not just for greens and fruit, but for the sharp bite of wild onions and garlic. These hardy plants grew along ditches and forest edges, and when boiled into water, they made a thin, pungent soup. It wasn't hearty. Most times it was just broth, clear, light, and flavored only by those wild bulbs. But in a life of constant hunger, even that thin soup carried power. The sulfur-rich plants helped fight off sickness, cleared the chest, and gave a sense of warmth when bellies were otherwise empty. Children might sip it like medicine, while adults drank it to stretch through long nights. And when scraps of salt pork or fat were added, if any could be spared, the soup turned into something closer to a real meal. Here's the legacy. Today, onions and garlic are the backbone of nearly every cuisine in the world. But for the enslaved, their wild cousins weren't just flavor, they were survival. A bitter broth that carried bodies through the hardest days. And with that, we come full circle. From roasted corn to bitter greens, from scrap bones to wild herbs, every dish tells the same story. Survival carved out of struggle, and a food culture that still echoes in Southern kitchens today. Looking back at these 25 survival foods, it's impossible not to feel the weight behind every bite. Enslaved people weren't just eating to fill their stomachs, they were battling starvation, turning scraps and weeds into meals that carried them through the unthinkable. Cornmeal mush, boiled greens, roasted pumpkin seeds, wild grapes. Each dish was a story of struggle, but also of resilience. What's striking is how many of these foods didn't just vanish with time. They became the backbone of Southern cooking. From okra and grits to chow chow, to bone broth, to chicory coffee. Dishes born out of hardship are now celebrated, even sold at a premium. But the roots of those foods aren't just about taste. They're about survival, creativity, and the will to keep going when everything else was taken away. And here's the hidden truth. Food wasn't only nourishment. It was memory. It was culture. It was identity that could not be broken, no matter how brutal the system tried to be. Every pot of greens, every sip of sassafras tea, every handful of parched corn was a quiet act of defiance, proof that life dignity, and tradition could endure. These weren't just survival foods, they were survival itself. But the story didn't end there, because in 1865, when slavery finally ended, those same people faced a new question. Where do we go from here? For decades, they stayed in the South, sharecropping, building communities, raising families. But by 1915, something shifted. Jobs opened up in the North, factories needed workers, and word spread like wildfire. There's a better life up there. So they packed their bags. They said goodbye to grandmother's porches and childhood fields. They boarded trains heading to Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, New York, cities that promised safety, opportunity, and a chance to breathe free. Between 1915 and 1970, over 6 million Black Americans made that journey. Historians call it the Great Migration. But here's what they couldn't leave behind: the food: collard greens, neck bones, cornbread, black-eyed peas. These weren't just recipes. They were roadmaps back home. Every bite told a story of survival, hope, and belonging. And while history remembers the movement of people, it forgets the meals that made it possible. So now, we're continuing our journey with 25 classic Southern foods African Americans actually ate during the Great Migration. The real dishes that built communities, stretched pennies, and kept faith alive one plate at a time. Because this isn't just food history, it's the story of how a people turned struggle into flavor, and flavor into freedom. Let's keep going. 1. Rice and gravy breakfast plates, the fuel of a new day. Before dawn in the Deep South, kitchens came alive with the sound of sizzling fatback and boiling pots. For families heading north, rice and gravy wasn't just breakfast, it was armor. A plate of soft white rice, ladled with rich brown gravy made from meat drippings, was the cheapest way to start a long day of work or travel, with something that felt like home. It didn't matter if the gravy came from a single pork chop or yesterday's ham bone, you made it stretch. The rule was simple: never waste flavor. That's how one pan of grease fed the whole house. Mother spooned it over rice, maybe added a fried egg if you were lucky, and sent their men into the fields or onto the train platforms with full stomachs and faith. When the Great Migration began, that same meal appeared in boarding houses and tenement kitchens across Chicago and Detroit. It was fast, filling, and cost next to nothing. Just rice, flour, and a splash of meat stock. Even today, it's proof that survival doesn't have to be fancy. Because in every spoonful of rice and gravy was a promise. You might be leaving home, but you'll never leave hungry. 2. Fatback and syrup sandwiches, the sweet and salty taste of hard times. Before bacon became breakfast royalty, there was fatback, thick, salty strips of pork, fried crisp and slapped between two pieces of white bread. Add a drizzle of syrup, and you had the working man's fuel. Cheap, greasy, and just sweet enough to feel like a treat. During the Great Migration, this was the kind of meal you could make anywhere. A boarding house in Detroit, a factory break room in Chicago, or a train car heading north. The salt from the fatback mixed with the syrup's sweetness to create that unforgettable Southern contrast. Poor in price, but rich in comfort. For families who couldn't afford ham or sausage, this was survival with a smile. A few slices of salt pork could feed everyone, and a bottle of cane syrup lasted all week. In 1925, the whole meal cost less than 10 cents. Even in 2025, it's barely $3. People remembered it not because it was fancy, but because it reminded them of home. Proof that a little sugar and salt could still make life taste good, no matter how hard the times. 3. Eggs and molasses toast, breakfast for the road north. When the trains rolled out of Mississippi or Alabama, many travelers carried a humble breakfast wrapped in wax paper, eggs and molasses toast. Simple, sticky, and full of warmth, it was the kind of meal that could travel, and that mattered when you were leaving everything behind. Molasses was the poor man's sweetener, thicker than honey and twice as comforting. Mothers would fry up eggs in leftover bacon grease, then spread molasses on slices of toast. Sometimes day-old bread, toasted right on the skillet. The sweetness softened the bitterness of the journey, while the eggs gave strength for whatever came next. By the time families reached Chicago or St. Louis, the smell of molasses still clung to their luggage, a reminder of Southern mornings that felt safe even when the world wasn't. In the North, people kept making it long after they could afford better, because this wasn't just breakfast. It was memory on a plate, proof that you could leave home, chase new dreams, and still start every morning tasting where you came from. 4. Homemade syrup biscuits, the breakfast that never quit. If you grew up in the rural South, you knew the smell. Hot biscuits coming out of a wood stove, brushed with homemade syrup that shimmered like liquid gold. Syrup biscuits were the kind of meal that stretched across generations, feeding both the poor and the proud. During the Great Migration, they were pure comfort on the move. Travelers packed them in brown paper bags for the long train rides north. Made from flour, lard, and buttermilk, these biscuits rose tall and flaky even without fancy ingredients. The syrup, usually cane, sorghum, or molasses, was stirred right on the stove, thickened until it clung to your fingers. No matter where families landed, from Chicago's South Side to Cleveland's industrial blocks, syrup biscuits stayed on the breakfast table. They were cheap, filling, and tasted like home. In 2025, you can still bake a dozen for under $4, but what you can't buy is that feeling, that small, sweet bite that said, "We made it." Because even when the money ran out, the warmth of syrup biscuits never did. 5. Cornmeal waffles with fried chicken bits, the breakfast of pride. Long before chicken and waffles became a soul food restaurant classic, Black families in the Great Migration were already making cornmeal waffles with fried chicken bits, a clever twist born from necessity, not luxury. Cornmeal was cheaper than flour, so it became the base of everything. Folks mixed it with a little sugar, baking powder, and lard, then poured the batter into heavy cast iron waffle irons that hissed when the heat hit. On top went scraps of leftover fried chicken, wings, backs, or whatever was left from Sunday dinner. Together, they turned scraps into something that tasted like celebration. This dish carried pride. It said, "We can make beauty out of what's left." In cramped apartments up north, families would serve it on Sunday mornings, the golden waffles stacked high, the smell of hot grease and sweetness filling the room. In 1940, it cost maybe 15 cents a serving. In 2025, you could still pull it off for $5, and it'll taste just as powerful, because in that mix of crunch and sweetness, you can still taste the South and the triumph of those who refuse to go hungry or unnoticed. 6. Smoked neck bone and cabbage stew, the stew that followed the smoked north. When times were lean, smoke was flavor, and nothing carried that flavor like smoked neck bones simmered with cabbage. This was the dish that made $1 stretch through the week, smoky, salty, and rich with the memory of southern porches and backyard fires. Neck bones were the butcher's leftovers, sold cheap or sometimes given away. But in the hands of a skilled southern cook, they became magic. Families boiled them slow with cabbage, onions, and pepper until the meat fell off the bone and the broth turned silky. One pot could feed 10 people, and it did. During the Great Migration, this stew followed families north. In Chicago's Bronzeville or Detroit's Black Bottom, the same aroma-filled small apartments, smoke, greens, and comfort. It wasn't fancy, but it smelled like home. Even now, you can make a pot for under $6, a meal that still warms the body and the heart. Because neck bones and cabbage weren't just food. They were proof that with smoke, patience, and love, You could turn even the humblest scraps into something sacred. 7. Chicken gizzards and rice gravy, the workers' feast. Before factory whistles echoed through the north, there was the sound of a skillet sizzling with chicken gizzards and rice gravy, a dish that turned toughness into tenderness. Gizzards were the cheapest cut you could buy, often tossed aside by butchers. But black families knew how to make them shine. They boiled them slow in seasoned water until tender, then fried them in flour and grease to build flavor. The leftover pan drippings became a rich brown gravy poured over rice, hot, hearty, and ready before sunrise. For men heading to steel mills or women scrubbing floors, it was fuel for survival. When the Great Migration scattered families northward, this meal came too, from Mississippi kitchens to Chicago apartments. Its smell meant love, labor, and something to look forward to at day's end. In 1935, it fed a family for under 15 cents. Even now, you can make it for less than $6. But the real value? The way it turned the struggle into something you could savor. Proof that the humblest cuts still carried the richest pride. 8. Braised ox tongue with onions, the forgotten Sunday supper. Before supermarkets wrapped everything in plastic, every part of the animal had a purpose, even the tongue. Braised ox tongue with onions was one of those forgotten Southern delicacies that poor families turned into a Sunday feast. Butchers sold it for pennies, and though it looked rough, cooks knew better. They'd simmer the tongue in seasoned water for hours, peel the outer skin, and slice it thin before letting it soak in a pan of onions, garlic, and gravy. What came out was tender, savory, and rich, a dish that tasted like victory over hardship. When families moved north, they brought that knowledge with them. In small apartments from Cleveland to Harlem, that same slow-simmered aroma filled the hallways, drawing neighbors to the door. It was more than dinner. It was dignity served hot. In 1920, the whole meal cost maybe 20 cents. In 2025, you can still pull it off for under $10. And when that first bite melts on your tongue, you'll understand why this poor man's roast was a taste of pride. Proof that nothing was wasted, not even hope. 9. Batter fried pork chops, the payday special. When Friday finally came and the paycheck hit, Southern families knew exactly what to cook. Batter fried pork chops. This was celebration food, the sound of oil popping in the skillet marking the end of another hard week. During the Great Migration, folks working factory floors or cleaning downtown offices saved this meal for payday. Pork chops were dipped in seasoned flour, sometimes with a splash of milk or beaten egg, and fried until golden and crisp around the edges. The smell alone could stop neighbors mid-step. It wasn't just about eating well. It was about feeling human again. After a week of cheap stews and beans, that first crunchy bite meant progress, a little reward for survival. Families gathered tight around the table, sharing laughter and stories between mouthfuls of meat and gravy. In 1942, you could fry a whole skillet for under 40 cents. In 2025, it's still a budget comfort, around $7 for a family meal. But the flavor? Priceless. Batter fried pork chops weren't just dinner. They were proof that joy could sizzle in even the smallest kitchens. 10. Ham bone and white bean stew, the pot that never went empty. In the Great Migration kitchens, ham bone and white bean stew was more than a meal. It was a ritual. One pot sat simmering on the stove, day after day, fed with whatever scraps the family could spare. A single ham bone, stripped clean of its meat, could flavor an entire week's worth of beans. This was the working family's lifeline. White beans soaked overnight, softening under slow heat until they soaked up every bit of smoky salt from that bone. Cooks would toss in onions, carrots, maybe a pinch of pepper if they had it. It was humble, but it filled bellies and stretched hope just a little further. Up north, that same smell drifted through tenement halls in Chicago and Pittsburgh, the scent of home carried by steam. Even when money ran out, the stew kept going. Add a handful of beans, a little water, and the flavor came back to life. In 1930, the whole pot cost less than a dime. Today, it's still under $5. Proof that love, patience, and one ham bone could keep a family fed and their spirits unbroken. 11. Stewed tomatoes with cornbread crumbles. The taste of southern summer. When the fields were full, but wallets were empty, stewed tomatoes with cornbread crumbles became the South's answer to comfort food. It was sweet, tangy, and filling. The kind of dish that could make a poor man feel rich for a few minutes. Cooks would stew garden tomatoes with sugar, butter, and a pinch of salt until the mix turned thick and glossy. Then they'd crumble in day-old cornbread, soft in the center, crisp at the edges, soaking up every drop like a sponge. Served hot, it was part side dish, part dessert, and all love. When black families headed north, this simple recipe came with them. You'd find it bubbling on stovetops in Baltimore row houses or Detroit kitchens, brightening gray factory mornings with a taste of southern summer. It was cheap too. In 1935, a bowl cost about 5 cents. In 2025, still under $3. But the flavor was pure memory. A reminder that even in the hardest times, a few garden tomatoes and a skillet of cornbread could feed both hunger and hope. 12. Candied carrots with brown sugar and cloves, the sweet side of struggle. In the South, sweetness wasn't just for dessert. It was medicine for the soul. And during the Great Migration, candied carrots with brown sugar and cloves became a small luxury that working families could actually afford. Carrots were cheap, easy to find, and grew almost anywhere. Cooks would slice them thin, simmer them in a pan with butter, sugar, and a dash of cloves until the sauce turned glossy and fragrant. That rich, spicy sweetness filled tiny kitchens with comfort, reminding families of Sunday dinners back home. Even in the northern cities where money was short and winter felt endless, a pot of candied carrots could make the room feel warm again. It was a taste of care, proof that even the humblest vegetable could shine with a little love and sugar. In 1930, the dish cost just a few pennies. In 2025, it's still under $4 to make. But its real worth lies in what it meant, turning struggle into sweetness, one pan at a time. 13. Boiled peanut butter greens. The Southern spin on survival. In the South, nothing went to waste, not even the greens most folks threw away. Collards, turnips, or mustard leaves all found a home in the pot. But during the Great Migration, cooks added a twist that made them unforgettable. Peanut butter. Peanuts were cheap, high in protein, and full of flavor. When mixed into a pot of boiled greens, they thickened the broth into something creamy and rich, like a southern version of stew. That spoonful of peanut butter turned a handful of leaves into a meal that stuck to your ribs and carried you through the day. Families who moved north kept the recipe alive. In small apartments from Memphis to Chicago, you could smell those earthy greens simmering slow, the peanut aroma blending with salt pork or onion. It was the smell of making do and making it good. In 1932, this dish fed a family for under 10 cents. In 2025, you can still make it for around $5. It's proof of what Southern cooks always knew. When you stir hope into the pot, even greens taste like gold. 14. Butter beans with fatback. The soul of the Sunday pot. If you grew up in a Southern kitchen, you know the sound. The gentle bubble of beans simmering low and slow. Butter beans with fatback were the heart of the Sunday pot. A dish that brought comfort to both the rich and the poor. But for migrating black families, it was pure survival dressed in flavor. Butter beans, big, soft, and creamy, soaked up every bit of salt and smoke from the fatback. The meat wasn't there for show. It was there for strength. Just a small chunk could turn plain beans into a full meal. Mother stirred the pot with one hand and hope with the other, letting it simmer while church songs drifted through open windows. When the Great Migration carried families north, the recipe followed, filling cold city apartments with the same southern warmth. It didn't matter if the beans came from a can or the fatback from a butcher's bin. It always tasted like home. In 1938, this pot cost a dime to make. In 2025, about $5. But the real flavor, it came from love, patience, and that smoky promise that tomorrow would be a little better. 15. Fried cabbage with hot vinegar. The poor man's feast with a kick. When times were tight, families knew how to make something out of nearly nothing. Fried cabbage with hot vinegar was that miracle dish. Simple, sharp, and full of soul. A head of cabbage, a splash of fatback grease, and a drizzle of hot vinegar turned into a meal that could wake up the whole block. In Southern kitchens, it started as a side dish, but during the Great Migration, it became a main event. Workers coming home from factories or rail yards could fry a pan of cabbage in minutes, crisp at the edges, smoky in the middle, and tangy enough to make your lips tingle. That vinegar wasn't just flavor, it was fire. A little spark in the middle of hard times. In the North, it stayed a favorite. You could smell it through the hallways of Chicago's South Side or hear the sizzle in Detroit's tenement kitchens. It was cheap, fast, and alive with flavor. A reminder that Southern heat wasn't just in the weather, it was in the food. In 1940, it cost a nickel to make. In 2025, it's still under $4. Because sometimes survival just needs salt, smoke, and a splash of attitude. 16. Fried bologna sandwich, the working man's lunchbox legend. In the 1940s and 50s, when money was tight and meat was scarce, fried bologna sandwiches became the great equalizer, the poor man's steak. All you needed was a skillet, a few slices of cheap bologna, and a heel of white bread. Cooks would slice the edges so the meat wouldn't curl, then fry it in leftover grease until the edges crisped and the center bubbled. Drop it between bread with mustard or a drizzle of syrup, and you had a sandwich that could carry a worker through a 12-hour shift. For thousands of black families who had traded southern fields for northern factories, this sandwich was more than lunch. It was pride in paper wrapping. A reminder that flavor wasn't about money. It was about making do and making it good. Kids loved the sizzle. Parents loved the price. In 1939, a loaf of bread and a pound of bologna cost barely 15 cents. In 2025, it's still one of the cheapest hot meals you can make, and somehow one of the best, because every bite still tastes like hustle, heart, and home. 17. Hot sausage po' boy sandwiches, the street food of the Great Migration. Before fast food chains ruled the cities, the streets themselves smelled like dinner. From Washington, D.C. to New Orleans, hot sausage po' boys, or the famous half smokes, became the taste of the Great Migration on the go. Vendors grilled spicy smoked sausages until their casings snapped, then tucked them into long rolls, slathered with mustard, onions, and peppers. The aroma was impossible to ignore, smoky, tangy, and alive. For workers pouring out of factories or musicians leaving late-night gigs, one bite was fuel, fire, and comfort all at once. These sandwiches were freedom food, cheap, quick, and entirely theirs. No fancy cutlery, no tablecloths, just flavor and survival between two pieces of bread. By the 1940s, they'd become a cornerstone of urban black culture, the street meal that built communities. And the best part? You could grab one for a dime. Even in 2025, a homemade version costs less than $6, but it still carries the same bite of rebellion. Because whether you called it a po' boy, a half smoke, or just dinner, everyone told the same story of people who refused to go hungry or unseen. 18. Chili Mac, the Cincinnati-style comfort that crossed cultures. When Southern cooks arrived in northern cities, they met new flavors and made them their own. Chili Mac was one of those beautiful accidents, a Midwestern favorite reimagined through Southern soul. In Cincinnati and Detroit, chili was everywhere. Spiced ground, beef ladled over noodles. Black families, used to stretching stews with rice or cornbread, took that idea and added their own flair. They thickened it with flour, seasoned it with onions, paprika, and a touch of vinegar, then poured it over macaroni. It was hearty, cheap, and felt like home, even if it came from somewhere new. Factory workers loved it because it filled you up fast and reheated easy. Moms loved it because a single pot could feed everyone. It became one of those dishes that tasted like both past and future, Southern roots with Northern grit. In 1941, you could make a big pot for a quarter. In 2025, it's still under $7. But more than that, it's a perfect symbol of the Great Migration, where cultures met in the kitchen and made something better together. 19. Catfish loaf with cornmeal crust. The Sunday supper that traveled north. Before salmon was ever wrapped in foil or trout grilled over coals, Southern families made the most of what swam nearby, catfish. And during the Great Migration, one clever twist kept that flavor alive in the North. Catfish loaf with a cornmeal crust. Fresh catfish was cleaned, flaked, and mixed with onions, eggs, and day-old bread, then packed into a loaf pan and dusted with cornmeal. Baked slow until golden, it sliced like meatloaf, but tasted like a riverbank summer evening. It was filling, portable, and perfect for those long train rides or work lunches up north. In places like St. Louis and Chicago, it became a weekend staple, the taste of home that could stretch across paychecks. Families gathered around it the way they once did around a fry pan back in Mississippi. It cost next to nothing. A few cents worth of fish scraps, some bread, and faith. Even now, for under $6, you can bake that same loaf, crisp outside, tender inside, and remember the hands that turned river fish into comfort food. Because catfish loaf wasn't just a meal, it was proof that Southern ingenuity could travel anywhere and still taste like home. 20. Turkey wing barbecue plates, the flavor of backyard freedom. Before ribs or brisket took the spotlight, it was turkey wings that ruled the backyard. Cheap, meaty, and easy to find, they became the hidden stars of barbecue pits from Georgia to Chicago during the Great Migration. Cooks knew how to turn toughness into tenderness, slow baking the wings until the skin crisped, then brushing them with homemade sauce thickened with molasses, vinegar, and pepper. The smell alone could pull a crowd. On Saturdays, backyards filled with smoke and laughter as families grilled on makeshift pits made from oil drums and bricks. For folks who couldn't afford pork or beef, turkey wings meant celebration without shame. They symbolized progress, proof that even in the city, a Southern cookout could still live strong. In the 1940s, a plate with slaw and cornbread cost maybe 15 cents. In 2025, it's around $8, but worth every bite. Because this dish wasn't just about barbecue, it was about belonging, about gathering together, sharing stories, and remembering that joy tastes even better when you make it yourself. 21. Vinegar pie, the dessert born from empty shelves. When sugar was scarce and lemons were a luxury, Southern cooks turned desperation into genius with vinegar pie. During the Great Migration, this humble dessert followed families north, a reminder that even hard times could end on a sweet note. The recipe was simple but brilliant. Flour, sugar, butter, water, and a splash of vinegar. That tartness mimicked lemon, giving the pie a bright, custard-like flavor without a single fruit in sight. Poured into a flaky crust and baked till golden, it came out tasting like something you'd swear cost more than pennies. In northern cities, vinegar pie became a taste of memory, made on quiet Sundays when homesick families wanted a slice of the South. It didn't need fancy ingredients or modern tricks, just a steady hand and a warm oven. In 1930, the pie cost under a dime to make. In 2025, maybe $4. But it still carries the same lesson. When life gives you nothing, make something that tastes like everything. 22. Applejack cake, the taste of celebration on a budget. When the Great Migration carried families north, holidays and Sundays still called for dessert. And Applejack cake became the star of those kitchen celebrations. Sweet, spiced, and simple. It was proof that you didn't need much to make something worth smiling about. Cooks used what they had: chopped apples, a splash of molasses or homemade syrup, and a good shake of cinnamon. Sometimes a little applejack, bootleg apple brandy, made its way into the batter, giving the cake a warmth that spread far beyond the oven. Baked in cast iron or a worn tin pan, it came out dark, sticky, and sweet, with edges caramelized just right. In the city, families baked it for birthdays, church picnics, or just to chase the chill off a long week. Kids licked the spoons clean. Parents called it poor man's spice cake. It cost under 15 cents in 1940, maybe $5 now. But its richness was never about money. Apple's Jack cake was about gratitude, turning everyday fruit and struggle into something golden, fragrant, and unforgettable. 23. Bread pudding with raisins and evaporated milk, the dessert that never let anything go to waste. In the kitchens of the Great Migration, nothing was ever thrown away, not even stale bread. Bread pudding was born from that thrift, transforming yesterday's loaf into tomorrow's comfort. With raisins, sugar, and a can of evaporated milk, it became the dessert that stretched pennies and warmed hearts. Mothers tore bread into pieces, soaked it in sweetened milk and eggs, then folded in a handful of raisins when they could afford them. A sprinkle of nutmeg or cinnamon turned it into something that smelled like celebration. Baked until golden and crisp at the edges, the pudding came out soft, custardy, and rich, proof that waste had no place in a wise kitchen. In the North, it became a Sunday favorite. Apartment windows steamed with the scent of vanilla and sugar, and kids fought for the corner pieces. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like love. In 1938, the whole dish cost less than a dime. In 2025, still under $5. But every bite carried more than sweetness. It carried survival, skill, and the joy of making something from almost nothing. 24. Buttermilk icebox pie, the cool taste of Southern comfort. When summers turned hot and the factories ran hotter, families up north longed for a bit of Southern cool. That's when buttermilk icebox pie came to the rescue. Creamy, tangy, and chilled to perfection. It was the taste of home that didn't need an oven, just patience and a fridge humming in a crowded kitchen. Made from buttermilk, eggs, sugar, and a splash of lemon or vinegar, it was poured into a simple crust and set in the icebox overnight. The result? A silky, custard-like pie that balanced sweet and sour in a way only Southern cooks could master. During the Great Migration, it became a rare kind of luxury, a cool slice of comfort after long days in the city heat. Kids waited for it like a holiday, scraping every crumb from the tin. In 1945, it cost maybe 12 cents to make. In 2025, under $6. But its true value was the calm it brought. A little moment of peace that said, we may be far from home, but we can still taste where we came from. 25. Cocoa syrup cake, the sweet ending of every hard week. For many families who made the long journey north, the week always ended the same way, with a pan of cocoa syrup cake cooling on the counter. It was the chocolate cake for people who couldn't afford chocolate, a masterpiece built from pantry scraps and a mother's determination. The secret was cocoa powder and homemade syrup, sugar, water, and a touch of vanilla boiled until glossy. Mixed into a simple batter of flour, lard, and milk, it baked up dark and tender, filling every corner of the home with the smell of comfort. After dinner, families sliced it into squares, sometimes topped with powdered sugar or a drizzle of leftover syrup. It wasn't just dessert, it was a reward. The sweet proof that even after a week of struggle, there was still something to celebrate. In 1943, it cost less than 15 cents to bake. In 2025, around $4. But its warmth, its smell, its joy, those were priceless. Because for generations of black families during the Great Migration, cocoa syrup cake wasn't just the end of the meal. It was the reminder that faith, flavor, and family could make life beautiful, even in the hardest times. When millions of African Americans left the South, they carried more than suitcases. They carried flavor. Every dish in this chapter, from rice and gravy breakfast to cocoa syrup cake, was a quiet declaration of strength. These weren't just meals. They were messages, proof that no matter how far you travel, home can still live in your hands, your heart, and your kitchen. Through these foods, families rebuilt communities from the ground up in Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and beyond. A plate of greens became a connection. A pot of beans became a bridge. And every bite carried the rhythm of gospel hymns, the laughter of porches, and the courage to start again. Because food has always been more than survival. It's memory you can taste. And the Great Migration wasn't just a movement of people. It was a migration of flavor, faith, and freedom. But by the 1950s, something changed. Black folks had built new lives up north. They had jobs, homes, churches, communities, but they still didn't have one thing: equality. Segregation was the law. Jim Crow ruled the South, and even in northern cities, racism followed them like a shadow. Separate water fountains, separate schools, separate everything. So they stood up, they marched, they sat down at lunch counters and refused to move. They rode buses into danger. They sang freedom songs in the face of police dogs and fire hoses. And through it all, they had to eat. But this time, soul food became something more than comfort. It became fuel. It became strategy. It became quiet resistance, cooked in church basements, served in safe houses, passed hand to hand during long nights of organizing. These meals didn't just feed bodies, they fed courage. Dr. King said, everybody can be great because everybody can serve. And behind every protest, behind every march, behind every victory, there was someone serving strength on a plate. Most of those dishes, forgotten. But if you stay with me, you'll uncover 25 soul foods that helped fuel the civil rights movement and why they should have never been left behind. This is the final chapter of our journey. Let's remember them together. 1. Philadelphia pepper pot soup. They called it the soup that won the war back in the Revolution, but by the time of the Civil Rights era, it had a new meaning in black kitchens. This was no ordinary stew. It started with cow tripe. The stomach, tough and rubbery at first, but cooked long enough, it turned soft and rich. Cassava thickened it with peppers, onions, and herbs tossed in like memories. It was bold. It was bitter. It was ours. During the winter of '63, when marches ran cold and long, this soup warmed hands and hearts. Folks ate it from metal pots by church steps in North Philly, fuel for another night of freedom meetings. Some say it smelled too strong, too funky. But to us, that smell was home. It filled kitchens where folks whispered plans and ironed Sunday best. And when you dipped your spoon in that dark broth, it didn't just feed your body, it told you, we've been here. We still here. That bowl reminded us that even scraps could carry power. 2. blackbird stew. Now this was for folks who knew how to make a meal out of nothing. Blackbird stew was made from birds caught out in the fields, sometimes with slingshots, sometimes with traps made from string and sticks. They'd pluck the feathers, gut the birds, and drop them into a pot with onions, greens, and whatever roots they could find. Add water, maybe a splash of vinegar, and let it simmer low till the meat fell off the bone. During the rural boycotts of '61, this stew was a lifeline, especially in places where folks were fired from jobs just for registering to vote. When money got tight and store shelves were off limits, folks turned to the land, and the land gave back. When you shared that pot, you weren't just eating, you were surviving together. Out on the back steps or under moonlight on old porches, elders passed down the know-how: how to catch a bird, how to stretch a meal, how to stay proud with a belly half full. That stew held more than meat. It held memory. 3. Raccoon stew. Some folks today might turn their nose up, but back then, raccoon stew was a meal you didn't waste. Down in the Gullah communities and across the Mississippi Delta, folks would skin that raccoon clean, soak it in salt water overnight, then cook it slow with onions, peppers, maybe a touch of vinegar or tomato. The meat was dark, rich, a little greasy, but when it was done right, it slid right off the bone. During the winter of 1960, after the first wave of student sit-ins, many young folks came home bruised and hungry. Some had lost their scholarships. Some lost their jobs. But when Grandma set a pot of raccoon stew on the stove, it meant you were still covered, still loved, no matter what the world took away. That pot didn't judge. It just filled the room with the kind of smell that told you you're still part of this family. And when everybody sat close, steam rising from chipped bowls, you could feel it. How food like this held folks together tighter than fear ever could. 4. Baked possum with sweet potatoes. Now don't laugh. Back then, possum was country gold. If you caught one fat off the persimmon tree, you had dinner and a story. Folks would clean it real careful, rub it down with salt, sometimes parboil it first, then roast it slow in the oven with sweet potatoes all around. The meat was gamey but tender, and them sweet potatoes soaked up every bit of that juicy fat, sticky, caramelized, and rich like molasses. During the harsh winter of '62 in Georgia, when SNCC organizers were sleeping on church floors and hiding from night riders, this dish was served hot by families who didn't have much, but gave everything. One elder said, "Ain't no room for fear when your belly full and your people standing tall." That smell of roasting possum and sweet yam told you were safe for the night, and maybe tomorrow too. It wasn't just about feeding the body, it was about keeping the fire lit, in the stove, in the home, and deep down in the soul. 5. Fried buffalo fish ribs. They called it poor man's ribs, but out in the Mississippi Delta, fried buffalo fish ribs were rich in flavor and pride. Buffalo fish ain't easy to clean, full of tiny bones and thick scales, but the folks who knew what they were doing could carve out the rib racks just right. They dredge them in cornmeal, fry them crisp in hot lard, and serve them with hot sauce or mustard on the side. That crunch, it was music on your tongue. In 1965, when marchers came home from Selma, battered but unbroken, it wasn't steak waiting for them. It was fish ribs, cooked on back porches and roadside fryers, passed out in brown paper sacks with a nod and a prayer. It wasn't fancy, but it said, "You did good, baby. Now rest." Kids would fight over who got the crispiest edge. Elders would sit real still while they ate, like they were remembering something deeper than the meal. And in that quiet, you felt it. How something as small as a fried fish bone could carry the weight of a people. 6. Freshwater turtle stew. Out by the bayous and creek beds, folks used to catch snapping turtles with baited lines or bare hands if they were bold. That meat was tough, full of muscle, but when stewed low with onion, garlic, and maybe a pinch of cayenne, it turned tender like beef. The broth came out dark and rich, sometimes with a little roux stirred in. Some added hard-boiled eggs or okra to stretch it. Turtle stew was slow food, the kind that made you wait, made you sit, made you remember. Back in '63, during the weeks after the Birmingham church bombing, a family down in Louisiana served turtle stew to neighbors who came grieving. No words, just bowls, passed from hand to hand, steam rising with the weight of sorrow and strength. That stew said what mouths couldn't. And when a young girl asked, "Why we eat turtle?" an elder leaned down and whispered, "'Cause it's hard outside, soft inside, just like us." That pot held more than meat. It held lessons. And in that quiet kitchen, with spoons scraping the bottom, you knew. This stew wasn't just survival. It was testimony. 7. Squirrel fricassee, or fried squirrel. Squirrel wasn't no stranger in black kitchens, especially out in the country. Boys go out at first light with a .22 rifle or a slingshot, come back with a sack full of squirrels ready to skin. Sometimes they fried them whole, crispy on the outside, juicy inside. But other times, they'd make fricassee, brown the meat in a skillet, then simmer it in gravy with onions and carrots till it fell clean off the bone. Serve it over rice or biscuits, and you had yourself a meal that could hush a hungry room. During the long organizing weeks of the Mississippi Freedom Summer in '64, food had to stretch. Squirrel dishes brought folks together. One elder told the story of feeding 14 volunteers with 6 squirrels and a whole lot of gravy. Said it was the night they planned the march to the courthouse. Nobody asked for seconds out of greed. They asked because that squirrel tasted like unity. And when the youngest dipped their biscuit in that gravy, you could see it in their eyes. Hope don't need much meat to grow. 8. Rabbit and dumplings. Now rabbit? That was Sunday best meat in hard times. Folks would set traps along the fence line or shoot one early in the morning, clean it by noon, and have it bubbling in a pot before the sun dipped low. They'd cook it slow in seasoned broth, let the rabbit fall apart soft, then drop in hand-rolled dumplings, thick and doughy, soaking up every drop. It wasn't just warm, it was filling. A stick-to-your-ribs kind of love, passed down from Big Mama's hands to yours. Back in '61, when student protests lit up Nashville, a church elder made rabbit and dumplings for every teen that got locked up and released. She served it out of a dented pot behind the pulpit, told them, "Y'all fighting out there, I'll feed you in here." And they ate like kings that day, with bruises on their faces and courage in their bellies. Some of those kids never forgot that pot. Years later, they'd talk about that rabbit and dumplings like it was the first time they truly felt seen, not as troublemakers, but as somebody's child, somebody's future. 9. Poke salad. Poke salad wasn't picked from no store. It came straight from the earth, wild and dangerous if you didn't know what you was doing. You had to boil it 2, sometimes 3 times to get the poison out. But once it was safe, seasoned up with bacon grease, garlic, and a little onion, it hit the soul like a hymn. Old folks said eating poke salad taught you patience. You had to treat it right, or it'd turn on you, kind of like the world outside. That bitter green taught you how to work with what you had, even when it didn't seem fair. During the voter registration drives in rural Alabama, poke salad showed up on more than a few dinner plates. It grew in backyards, beside ditches, behind shotgun houses. And for families who lost wages just for registering to vote, it was one of the few greens that didn't cost a dime. Folks didn't brag on it, but they leaned on it, the same way they leaned on each other. That pot of boiled down leaves didn't just fill a plate. It told you, we gonna make it anyway. 10. Hot water, cornbread, or Johnny cakes. Ain't a soul who grew up in the South that don't remember hot water cornbread. Just cornmeal, salt, and boiling water, mixed till thick, shaped by hand, then fried in a cast iron skillet till golden brown, crispy outside, soft in the middle. It was the kind of bread that never needed butter to be good. These little cakes hit the table when there wasn't time, or flour for biscuits. They cooked fast and filled you faster. And in homes where marches were being planned and leaflets printed by hand, hot water cornbread kept bellies quiet and spirits high. Back in 1968, after the Memphis sanitation strike and Dr. King's final speech, many households across the South served Johnny cakes in silence. Folks dipped them in beans, sopped up stew, or just ate them plain with a heavy heart. No words, just a taste of something that had always been there, solid, humble, unshaken. And maybe that's why we loved it so much, 'cause in a world that felt like it could fall apart, that little round cake never let us down. 11. Corncob broth with onion skins. When the cupboard was near empty and every penny mattered, folks turned to things most people threw away. Corn cobs left bare after eating, onion skins too tough to chew, boil them both slow, and you had yourself a broth. Golden, sweet, and full of flavor. This soup base was a quiet trick passed down through generations, especially during the lean years before and during the civil rights struggle. Folks would use it to stretch beans, greens, or whatever scraps they had left, turning waste into warmth. In '66, during long nights of organizing in Arkansas, this broth bubbled in borrowed pots behind churches. It wasn't about pride. It was about purpose. A warm bowl passed between hands reminded everyone, we may not have much, but we make something out of nothing. And somehow, even without meat or money, that pot still carried dignity. It told you, we don't waste a thing. Not food, not time, not each other. Kids learned early. Even the thrown away parts could give back if you treated them right. That lesson didn't stop at soup. It showed up in how we treated our people too. 12th, ash cake wrapped in collard leaves. Ash cakes were born straight from the ground. No pan, no oven, just hot ashes from the fire and a little faith. You took cornmeal, water, maybe a pinch of salt, and shaped it with your hands. Then you wrapped it in collard leaves and tucked it right into the embers. Let the heat do its slow work. When it came out, smoky, earthy, full of soul. Peel back them collard greens and you had a bread that told stories without speaking. During the long protests in Georgia, when folks couldn't afford flour or sugar, ash cakes were the answer. Elders made them in the backyard while the young ones came back from sit-ins, tired, hungry, but proud. That bite of warm cornmeal soothed the nerves and filled the gaps between anger and hope. Some folks use ashes from pecan wood or hickory, giving the bread a deep, smoky flavor you couldn't fake. Kids would fight over the crusty bits, burnt edges and all, because that's where the magic was. And when the bread cracked just right, steam pouring out, it felt like the earth itself was offering comfort. 13. Roasted pig ear slabs. Now, pig ears might sound strange to some, but back then, that was prized meat, cleaned real good, boiled till tender, then laid out flat and roasted slow until the edges crisp like bacon. Folks would slice them thick, drizzle on vinegar or hot sauce, and chew on that cartilage like it was candy. They were salty, savory, with just enough chew to make you work for it. But that texture, that flavor, it stayed with you. And in neighborhoods where supermarkets wouldn't sell decent cuts to black folks, we made the most of what others threw away and turned it into gold on a plate. One Sunday in Birmingham, a church fed 100 marchers after they walked miles in protest. All they had were pig ears and potatoes, but folks ate like it was a feast, laughed, passed plates, held hands. And for a moment, even the police sirens outside couldn't shake the warmth inside. Kids would gnaw on those crispy edges, sauce running down their chins, and elders would smile, remembering harder times. That plate reminded them, we didn't just survive, We seasoned the struggle. 14. Homemade Southern tea cakes. Soft, sweet, and simple. Tea cakes were the cookies your grandma made when sugar was scarce and love had to stretch. Just flour, butter, a little sugar, and maybe some nutmeg if you had it. Pressed flat by hand, baked golden, and cooled right on the windowsill. These weren't store-bought sweets. They were passed down in stained recipe cards in memory. In Mississippi kitchens during the civil rights years, tea cakes showed up after meetings, in lunch sacks, and on church steps. Mothers would wrap them in wax paper and tuck them into coat pockets, a soft reminder that somebody was waiting for you to come home safe. In 1963, after the Birmingham church bombing that took the lives of 4 little girls, Miss Elsie baked batch after batch of tea cakes. She said, "My hands can't stop the hate, but they can hold the dough." Those cookies became something holy that day, soft circles of peace in a world that had gone cold. Some elders called them freedom cookies, 'cause even in the thick of fear and fire, they brought comfort, sweet and gentle like a hymn humming in the kitchen. 15. Salmon croquettes. You'd find a can of salmon in just about every pantry back then. Cheap, shelf-stable, and packed with protein. Mash it up with breadcrumbs, onions, a little egg, and season it right. Then fry it in hot grease till it sizzled brown on both sides. That's a salmon croquette. They were humble, but they filled your plate and your spirit. In many homes, they showed up on Friday nights right after payday, or when money ran low, but pride stayed high. Folks dressed them up with mustard, hot sauce, or a slice of tomato if you had one. When the Montgomery bus boycott dragged into its second year, salmon croquettes became the meal that kept folks going. Churches handed out lunch sacks to folks walking to work, and often inside was a croquette, still warm from a sister's skillet. It wasn't just a meal, it was a message. We got you. That little patty reminded folks that struggle didn't mean going without. Not when you had a whole community ready to fry up hope by the handful. 16. Virginia peanut stew. Peanut stew came from deep roots. Africa to the south, pot to the soul. Made with ground peanuts, onions, maybe tomatoes, and a touch of spice. It simmered into something thick, rich, and healing. Folks in Virginia swore by it on cold nights or long days when bellies groaned and spirits sagged. This wasn't your average stew. It wrapped you up like a wool coat and whispered, "You gonna be all right." Elders said it kept blood strong and bones steady. And during the civil rights years, it fed more than hunger. It fed courage. Protesters spooned it down before marches, its warmth rising all the way to their fists. In Danville, 1963, a woman named Mother Reba served peanut stew out of her home after every rally. Folks lined up quiet and tired and left with a full bowl and a stronger heart. She'd say, "Ain't no fear that don't melt in peanut stew." And truth be told, she was right. That stew wasn't just food. It was resistance in a bowl, creamy and bold, made from the same soil that tried to hold us down. 17. Spoon bread. Spoon bread wasn't bread like most folks think. It was soft, like pudding almost, made from cornmeal, milk, eggs, and butter. You had to scoop it with a spoon, hot and fluffy, right out the oven. Sweet or savory, it slid across the plate like a warm blessing. Down in North Carolina, spoon bread was a staple at meetings, funerals, and freedom rallies alike. It didn't matter how loud the world got. One bite of that creamy cornmeal hush, and you remembered where you came from. Folks would pass it around in cast iron dishes, each dip into the pan, bringing folks closer. During the sit-ins in Greensboro, mothers packed spoon bread into jars and carried it to the jailhouse. It'd be cold by the time it got there. But even cold, it stuck to your ribs and made you feel loved. Even kids called it church cloud, 'cause it was soft like heaven and always showed up when the choir sang loud and the prayers ran deep. And when you saw that golden top crack under your spoon, it felt like hope breaking through, soft, warm, and ready to rise again. 18. Callous. Early in the morning down in New Orleans, the callous women would walk the streets with baskets on their heads, calling out, "Callous, Bell's Callas." These were sweet rice fritters, leftover rice, a little flour, eggs, sugar, and spice, fried golden and dusted with powdered sugar. They weren't just breakfast, they were memory. Sold by black women long before the civil rights movement, callous kept the spirit of freedom alive through taste and hustle. They helped feed families, paid rent, and reminded folks that survival could be sweet too. When segregation kept folks from the front of the bakery, these women brought the bakery to the people. You'd hear their voices before sunrise, echoing through narrow streets, and by the time the sun peeked over the bayou, the smell of fried rice and sugar filled the air. And in the 60s, when marches passed through New Orleans, old-timers still made callous to hand out in brown paper bags. One bite, and you weren't just tasting fried rice. You were tasting black joy, resilience, and tradition, warm in your hand and never far from your heart. 19. Pepper pot, women's cassava dumplings. They call them freedom dumplings in some corners. Thick, chewy cassava dumplings drop straight into bubbling pepper pot stew. These weren't delicate. They were heavy, filling, and meant to last. Made from grated cassava, salt, and a woman's knowing hand, they soaked up every drop of broth like a sponge for struggle and strength. In Philly, the pepper pot women, street vendors and home cooks alike, handed out bowls for pennies or for nothing at all if you couldn't pay. Their dumplings stuck to your bones, gave you the energy to keep moving and the comfort to know someone cared. Back during the 1964 Freedom Summer, volunteers remembered those dumplings more than the speeches. Long nights, organizing voter drives turned into warm meals shared around one pot, stories traded with steam rising between bowls. And when a spoon hit the bottom, all you saw was cassava and courage, thick with history, quiet power, and the hands of women who stirred freedom into every bite. And long after the stew was gone, the memory of those dumplings stayed, like the sound of a strong woman's voice carrying through the streets before the sun came up. 20. Pan-toted service pan hash. This was the kind of meal built from scraps. Yesterday's meat, leftover rice or grits, maybe a spoon of beans, all fried up together in a dented tin pan. Folks called it service pan hash because it was carried to the fields, the factories, and the protests in pans wrapped in cloth or tucked under arms. In the Jim Crow South, where black folks couldn't sit at no lunch counter, this was how we fed ourselves. Women would tote these pans to factory gates or church steps, lifting the lids to share with anyone who needed it. The smell alone, spicy, smoky, honest, would make your stomach call out like a choir. During the marches in Selma, when bodies were tired and feet were blistered, pan-toted hash showed up like an old friend. Shared from one lap to another, it gave just enough strength to stand back up, face forward, and keep on walking. You couldn't buy it in no restaurant. You couldn't box it up. This was food from the soul, carried in hands that had held babies, picked cotton, and still had the strength to stir a pot for somebody else. 21. Butlered ham jowls stew. Ham jowls ain't just scraps. They're the secret meat, hidden under the cheek, rich with fat and flavor. When simmered slow in a stew with onions, peppers, and maybe some okra or greens, they turned tender as a lullaby. Folks called it butlered when it was seasoned real fine and cooked long with love. This dish was Sunday special in many homes, especially when money was low, but spirits were high. The meat clung to the bone just right, and when it hit your tongue, it tasted like home. Black families passed down the method quiet and proud, knowing jowls fed both stomach and story. In Montgomery, during the carpool drives of the bus boycott, families would gather after dark, passing around steaming bowls of jowl stew to drivers who'd been on the road all day. It kept them warm, kept them fed, and reminded them they weren't doing this alone. And when that pot scraped empty, folks would mop it clean with bread crust, nodding slow. Because in that stew, you could taste what it meant to endure and what it meant to be loved through it. 22. Fried frog legs or crawfish patties. Now this one came straight from the swamps and bayous where folks knew how to pull a meal from the mud. Frog legs were cleaned, seasoned, and fried till crispy like chicken wings. Crawfish got chopped, mixed with cornmeal and spices, then pan-fried into patties that sizzled like summer. Down in Louisiana and parts of Mississippi, these weren't strange foods. They were everyday blessings. Folks fished them out at dawn, caught by hand or net, and cooked them up by noon. Some say the best ones came from church fish fries, where the line wrapped around the block and the grease never stopped popping. In 1965, after the march from Selma to Montgomery, a small church just outside Baton Rouge hosted a homecoming meal. They had no money for beef or pork, so they brought in what they could catch, frog legs and crawfish, and the people ate like kings, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. And when that first bite hit, juicy, spiced, and wild, it told you something plain. We might not have much, but what we got, we make beautiful. 23. Boiled peanuts and collard pot liquor blend. Boiled peanuts were the snack of the South, soaked in salt water and boiled till soft, almost creamy inside. And pot liquor, that was the deep green broth left behind after cooking down collard greens, thick with nutrients, memory, and soul. Poor folks didn't waste nothing. They'd take the pot liquor, pour it into mugs, and sip it slow, hot, salty, and healing. Mix that with a handful of warm boiled peanuts, and you had a medicine stronger than any pill. Elders swore it cured colds, heartaches, and heavy days. In Albany, Georgia, during voter registration drives, neighbors handed out jars of pot liquor to tired organizers. It was cheap, yes, but rich in every way that counted. It gave energy to feet worn from knocking on doors, and peace to minds weighed down by hate. And when someone passed you a bowl, they weren't just feeding your body, they were saying, you belong here, you matter, and we'll get through this together. Some folks even crumbled cornbread right into that pot liquor, soaking it up like a sponge. That last spoonful, it felt like a hug from your grandma, warm, strong, and just what you needed to carry on. 24. Gullah Sea Island Pepper Pot. This wasn't your everyday stew. Gullah pepper pot came from the Sea Islands, simmered slow with okra, tomatoes, seafood, and garden herbs. It was thick, spicy, and bold, like the language and spirit of the Gullah people themselves. You could smell it cooking before you even got to the porch. Back in the day, this pot fed whole families after long days in the fields. Folks would toss in shrimp, crab, sometimes fish heads, whatever the tide gave them. Okra thickened it up. Tomatoes gave it tang, and that broth. It clung to your spoon like history hanging on. During the Civil Rights Movement, when organizers came through the coastal lowcountry, Gullah elders made pepper pot for them. They called it freedom stew, something sacred you only serve to the brave. It kept bellies full and spirits lit like a lantern in the dark. And each spoonful held the rhythm of the islands, strong, steady, and rooted deep. It reminded folks where they came from and gave them the fire to keep marching toward where they were going. 25. Field greens and sorrel herbal drink. Before sodas and sweet tea filled up tables, folks quenched their thirst with what the land gave them. Sorrel, bright red hibiscus petals, got steeped with ginger and clove, sweetened with molasses or honey, and served cold in tin cups, sometimes mixed with foraged field greens like dandelion or sassafras. It wasn't just a drink, it was a tonic. In Mississippi and Alabama, this herbal brew was sipped on porches and packed into jars for long train rides to rallies. It cooled the body after hot days in the sun, calmed nerves before facing police lines, and reminded people of the old ways that kept them strong. One elder called it marching juice, said when the world got heavy, a swig of that sorrow would clear your head and put strength back in your legs. It wasn't sweet like store-bought drinks. It was bold, earthy, and honest. And every time it hit your tongue, it reminded you, the roots we drink from run deep, and they carry everything we've been through, bitter, sweet, and everything in between. Now, you've walked the full journey with us. From the plantation fields where soul food was born out of scraps and survival, to the great migration trains where it traveled north as memory and hope, to the civil rights marches where it fueled a revolution. You've tasted a piece of our past, not just in food, but in fire, in family, in fight. These weren't just meals that filled stomachs. They built a culture. They carried us through slavery, migration, and the long march toward freedom. Every pot of greens, every fried fish, every bowl of stew passed hand to hand. They all told the same story. We endure, we create, we survive. From parched corn in the 1700s to pepper pot soup in the 1960s, the thread never broke. It stretched across centuries, across states, across struggle, held together by the hands of mothers who stirred hope into pots, fathers who fried courage in cast iron, and children who sipped strength from soup bowls. This is the real story of soul food, not just fried chicken and mac and cheese, but survival turned sacred, scraps turned into tradition, suffering turned into strength. And here's the beautiful part. That food is still here, still on our tables, still feeding us, still connecting us to ancestors we never met, but can taste in every bite. So if these dishes stirred something in you, a memory, a hunger, a pride, don't let them fade again. Share this story. Pass it down. Cook one of these recipes. Teach your kids where it came from. Keep the taste of our history alive. Because soul food isn't just what we eat. It's who we are. It's where we've been. And it's proof that even in the darkest times, we can create something beautiful, something lasting, something that feeds the body and the soul. If this story touched you, hit that subscribe button. We're keeping the past alive here. One plate, one story, one memory at a time. Welcome to the America we remember, where old recipes never die, and neither do the people who made them.